Welcome everyone to our Friday lecture series, even though it's Saturday. Right now, it's Saturday morning right now. And yeah, today I'm very happy that we have Evan Restra here to give a talk. Evan Restra is an assistant professor at Purdue University who works mainly in moral philosophy, moral psychology, and philosophy of cognitive science. He's been working extensively on questions about the existence of moral character, about our ability to interpret others' minds, and recently the foundation of social norms. His work can be found in a series in most of the top journals in analytic philosophy, such as the British Journal of the Philosophy of Science, Synthes, and Philosophical Studies. And I think Evan is perhaps best known for his work on moral character and for his defense of a mind-reading rich way of talking about the problem of other minds. Today, he will talk about a new framework. A new framework for social norms in the cognitive sciences. Evan, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Julius, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak. So as Julius said, today I'm going to tell you all about a project I've been working on with Professor Kristen Andrews at York University on the cognitive science of social norms. So as a first pass definition, you can think of social norms as roughly the set of social rules that dictate which behaviors are appropriate or permissible or obligatory in different situations for members of a given community. So this initial characterization obviously covers a vast array of social behaviors, everything from how we queue up in line at the airport, to practices surrounding sex and gender, to the way that we behave and dress when we're at a funeral, to our customs of polite greeting. Now, the basic goal of the cognitive science of social norms is to explain how we learn the social norms, these rules in our communities, why we are, to explain why we're motivated to conform to them, and to explain why we enforce these norms upon each other. Now, the cognitive science of social norms comes up in a variety of different literatures, and increasingly it's being used both as a lens for understanding human behavior and as an instrument to change our behavior for the better. For example, the cognitive science of social norms figures quite prominently in various accounts of the evolution of human cooperation, showing up in different forms in the work of people like Joseph Henrich and Kim Sterelny. In his recent posthumously published book, The Open Society and Its Complexities, the late political philosopher Jerry Gauss drew on the cognitive science of social norms to push back against Friedrich Hayek's conservative pessimism about human nature. And philosophers like Cristina Bicchieri have been working to apply the science of norms in the hopes of developing nudges and other kinds of interventions as a way to promote human rights in the developing world. But despite its growing prominence, the cognitive science of social norms remains in many ways frustratingly fragmented. And this is because it's often unclear whether different models, different theories of the psychology of social norms are really models of the same thing. Now, granted, when you read books and articles articulating these theories, they all tend to begin in roughly the same way, by listing off similar examples of social norms, not unlike the ones that I just led with, which suggests that all these authors are interested in the same broad class of social behaviors. But the trouble starts once these theories move past these examples of social norms and start to articulate what they take to be their core psychological features. That is, what it is to have internalized a social norm or to be motivated by a social norm. So as you'll see throughout this talk, there is disagreement about whether or not having a social norm means having a stored representation of a rule, whether it means that we're intrinsically motivated to punish norm violators, or whether norm conformity has a distinctive affective phenomenology. And this in turn can make it very difficult to compare these theories to one another and to apply them to less than paradigmatic cases. For example, in recent debates about how social norms evolved and whether they're present in non-human animals. And so the central motivation of this project I'm going to tell you about today is really to just try to make some sense of this disunified literature and to try to propose a shift in strategy. So to give you a small brief preview, my conclusions are going to be at once deflationary and optimistic. Once we give up some problematic assumptions, I do think there's going to be room for a robust and interesting cognitive science of social norms. But I suspect that there's a good chance that what we learn from that science will reveal a messy and heterogeneous phenomenon, and that the generalizations about social norms that it delivers are likely to be quite narrow, and that they will not support a unified or elegant theory. But with the right methodological approach and the right explanatory framework, we can still gain quite useful insights into the way that social norms shape our lives. So here's how this talk is going to proceed. I'm going to start by giving you all a quick crash course on some of the major theories in this literature. And along the way, I'm going to emphasize how they all employ different conceptions of social norms. Then I'm going to try to diagnose what I see as the heart of the problem in these theories, which has to do with the way that they have construed their explanatory project. Then I'm going to make a methodological recommendation that the way to make progress in this field is by adopting a revised conception of social norms that makes minimal assumptions about their mental, psychological underpinnings, and instead focuses on the way that they arise out of social interactions. With this reformed explanatory framework in hand, I'm then going to outline a novel empirical proposal about the cognitive architecture of the normative cognition that is not currently represented in the literature, which I'm going to call normative pluralism. Now, according to this view, the psychological underpinnings of social norms are in fact the product of a heterogeneous set of cognitive and affective processes. Once I'm through with my methodological suggestion and empirical proposal, I'll end by preemptively tackling a couple of objections to this framework that I've encountered when presenting this work in the past. Okay, here we go. So the first model of the psychology of norms that I want to tell you about is Cristina Bicchieri's conditional social expectations account. Now, according to this view, a social norm is a rule of behavior such that individuals prefer to conform to it on the condition that they believe that, one, most people in their community conform to it, and two, that most people in their community believe others ought to conform to it. Now, right away, what's notable about this account is that social norms end up being fairly cognitively sophisticated. Because in order to have a social norm, you don't just have to judge whether or not other people in your community are following a given rule, but also whether or not other people think that the rule should be followed. So in effect, on this view, having social norms requires having fairly advanced theory of mind abilities. For Bicchieri, it is also quite important that identifying this particular pattern of conditional social preferences can actually be used as a way of diagnosing social norms in the wild. So what that means is that if you see a pattern of behavior that is not the product of this particular pattern of conditional social preferences, then it isn't a genuine social norm in her books. Now, another really influential account in this literature is Srpada and Stitch's model of the norm system, which is supposed to be a domain-specific psychological adaptation for cooperation and cultural transmission that enables the acquisition, storage, and execution of social norms. So according to this theory, norms are acquired via heuristics like copy the majority or copy prestigious individuals in your community. They're then stored as representations of rules in a norms database. And then when a norm is activated in a particular context, this triggers an intrinsic affective motivation, either to comply with the norm or to punish those who violate them. So on this view, social norms are really just the patterns of behavior that are produced by the norm system. Now, notably, this norm system view does not require all that much in terms of a theory of mind, unlike in the previous model. And moreover, proponents of this view suggest that the norm system is grounded in system one processes, meaning that it's supposed to operate in a fast and automatic and largely unconscious manner. Now, recently, the neuroscientists Jordan Thoreau, Lisa Feldman Barrett, and Leanne Young have proposed a model of the psychology of norms that is grounded in the broader framework of prediction error minimization. Now, oversimplifying slightly, what they're proposing is that the motivation to comply with social norms really stems from a more basic drive to make the world around us a more predictable place. So the basic idea is that other agents, other people can become unpredictable and erratic when you do what they don't expect. So to make sure that other agents don't behave in a way that surprises us, we need to behave in a way that doesn't surprise them. And so when we navigate the social environment, we often feel this affective flash that they call the sense of should, which warns us when our behaviors might be surprising to others, and it motivates us to conform to their expectations. So social norms on this view are really the patterns of behavior that arise from the sense of should. Now, one thing that makes this view very different from the other two is that it does not invoke any representations of rules whatsoever, or a disposition to punish others. So instead, social norms are essentially characterized by having this particular affective phenomenology, this felt compulsion to comply with the social expectations of others. Now, the last account of social norms that I want to tell you about comes from developmental psychology, from researchers like Michael Tomasello, Marco Schmidt, and Hannes Rakoczy. According to this view, the psychology of social norms emerges from a more basic capacity for shared intentionality. Now, shared intentionality refers to our capacity to represent goals and intentions as shared across cooperative partners, a kind of collective we mode that we adopt in the context of joint action when we do things together. So according to this account, working towards a common goal with another individual can often generate a primitive sense of normative commitment, such that we might feel obligated to fulfill our role in a shared activity, and also to protest when our partner fails to fulfill their role. Now, social norms, according to this view, are supposed to work in pretty much the same way. The major difference is that the relevant we in the we mode of social norms here refers to our broader social group. And so just as we might get annoyed and protest when someone doesn't play their role in a dyadic joint activity, we also get annoyed and protest when people in our community don't abide by shared social norms because they're not playing their proper role. Now, the notable feature about this view is that it's really essentially emphasizing representations of a kind of collective group identity, much more so than in the other views we've seen. Now, what I hope to show you with this brief survey is that all of these proposals about the cognitive science of social norms are making very different assumptions about their core psychological properties. So there is variability in terms of whether or not social norms are thought to require explicit representations of rules, or even meta representations of rules, or no rule-based representations at all. There is also disagreement about the extent to which the motivation to punish norm violators is important, or whether social norms always trigger representations of social identity, or whether they have this distinctive affective component. The range of cognitive sophistications for these models is also quite striking. Some of them invoke fairly high-level sophisticated processes, others invoke fairly low-level and simple processes. So in other words, despite their nominally shared project, it's not obvious that they are all talking about the same psychological phenomenon. Instead, what we seem to have here is really a loose cluster of psychological properties, all associated with different aspects of whatever it is that we call social norms. Now, one domain where this issue has proven especially problematic is in a recent debate about whether or not there are social norms in non-human animals, especially in our nearest cousins, chimpanzees, which display a variety of behaviors that some researchers have sought to explain in normative terms. For example, some immigrant female chimpanzees will tend to adopt the tools of their new community, and they'll abandon their old tool use practices, even when the new tools are actually less effective than the old ones, and the old ones remain available, which suggests a kind of socially motivated kind of conformity. And you also have third-party chimpanzees who have been observed to protest fiercely whenever young chimpanzees are mishandled, suggesting that they observe and enforce some kind of rules surrounding the proper treatment of infants. There have also been documented cases of chimpanzee fashion trends when a female chimpanzee living in a sanctuary started to wear a straw-like blade of grass in her ear, and all the other chimpanzees started to do the same. So I could go on. But here we have to ask, what would constitute evidence that any of these behaviors are really, in fact, the product of socially normative thinking? Well, that's really going to depend on which psychological characterization of social norms you adopt. For example, according to the norm system view that I mentioned, a key indicator of having social norms would be evidence of intrinsically motivated punishment of norm violators. So if you held this view, then to test for norms, what you would want to do is you want to look for examples of third-party punishment in wild and captive chimpanzee populations. But then you would also need to carefully rule out alternative explanations of these behavior that are grounded in instrumental motivations, like a desire for dominance. But as previously mentioned, there are a number of accounts where of social norms where a disposition to punish norm violators is not a necessary element at all. On the sense of should account, for example, we would probably be better off trying to measure primates' affective responses to nonconformity using techniques like maybe pupillometry or infrared imaging. So maybe you're starting to see the problem here, which is depending on our psychological construal of social norms, we end up with entirely different and to some extent orthogonal research programs. Now, it's worth comparing this fragmented state of affairs in the animal norms debate with some of the success stories that we see in other areas of comparative cognition research, like in the study of episodic memory or numerosity or belief attribution. Now, despite their many internal debates, in each of these domains, there's actually a pretty decent consensus about the nature of the relevant cognitive abilities that they're trying to study. For instance, episodic memory requires the ability to store information about the what, where, and when of an event. Understanding cardinal numbers means being able to implement a successor function. And possessing the concept of belief requires the ability to represent that another person has beliefs that can be false and can misrepresent the world. So these standards are generally not theory dependent, and so they enable researchers to do some fairly straightforward and productive comparative investigations. But this isn't so for the cognitive science of norms, where we can't even seem to agree on what a social norm is in human beings, let alone in chimps or in other animals. So my hunch here is that this fragmentation is all a symptom of a deeper problem in this area of study, which is that these theories have adopted an unhelpful way of construing their explanatory project, and that they have made an assumption about the psychological unity of social norms that we are not yet justified in making. So to make my case here, I'm going to draw on a distinction that the philosopher Robert Cummins has drawn between two conceptions of explanation in psychology, which I think is going to be really useful in characterizing both how social norm theorists are currently approaching their project and also where they might be going wrong. Okay, so Cummins' first conception of explanation in psychology is basically a version of the deductive nomological model of explanation. So according to this view, the job of psychologists is to go out and uncover law-like generalizations that allow us to make reliable predictions about behavior and attitudes. Now, in psychology, we do find such laws, and they're usually called effects. For example, you have the bystander effect, or the Dunning-Kruger effect, or the McGurk effect, the endowment effect, and so on. And so, in a way, this actually seems to be what we get, albeit on a fairly local level, when we identify a behavioral phenomenon as a social norm. Because doing so allows us to make a variety of predictions about behavior and attitudes in that domain. For example, if we know that it is a social norm that when you hear the national anthem come on at a sporting event, then you need to stand up. Then you can reliably expect that the next time you're at a sporting event in the United States or elsewhere that you hear the national anthem, you can predict that everyone is going to stand. And you can also predict that when someone doesn't follow this norm, they're likely to be met with some kind of negative response. So one way of thinking of social norms, according to this approach, would be as a kind of class of effects. However, Cummins argues that this approach to psychological explanation is actually incomplete. While identifying these law-like regularities of this sort might help us to make various behavioral predictions and generalizations, it doesn't actually help us to understand why these irregularities are occurring. So really, identifying effects actually only helps us to specify our explanandum, that is what we're interested in explaining. So once an effect has been identified, it still needs to be explained by appeal to some further underlying capacity. So this leads me to Cummins' other model of psychological explanation, namely functional analysis. So according to this model, the real explanatory action in psychology happens at the level of cognitive capacities, which you can think of as complex dispositional properties that are specified at Marr's computational level of analysis. Some examples of capacities include those that I mentioned before: episodic memory, numerosity, and theory of mind. So capacities in this framework are really what give rise to effects. And so the goal of functional analysis is to take an appropriately specified psychological capacity and then break it down into a number of better understood dispositions or processes. And then different psychological frameworks provide us with different sets of tools for doing this kind of functional analysis. So in other words, functional analysis is going to be what explains capacities, and capacities are what explain effects. So if we take this approach and we apply it to the cognitive science of social norms, well, then it looks like the proper goal, the cognitive science of social norms, should be to give a functional analysis of a cognitive capacity to comply with and enforce the social norms of one's community. Now, I am going to give this capacity a name. I'm going to call it ought thought. So this, I think, is what most of the theories I just described see themselves as doing. They have specified a species-typical cognitive capacity for ought thought that they think is largely responsible for the class of effects that we call social norms. And then all the frameworks we just discussed offer different kinds of functional analyses of this capacity. Note that there's an additional assumption coming into play in this model, however, which is despite their massive variability, the class of effects that we call social norms can all really be explained by appeal to this same core capacity. So in this view, the behavioral differences that we see in social norms across all different kinds of cultures are in some sense only at the surface level. And that underneath that variability, there's still this common underlying process, a kind of universal grammar of society, as Beijing might put it. But as we've seen, there simply is no shared understanding of what ought thought is. Instead, each model provides its own specification of what the capacity for ought thought consists in. So while there's a sense in which all these models are doing the same thing, because they're all talking about that same broad class of effects, they're actually not talking about the same capacity. At best, they're talking about a cluster of related capacities. Now, a lack of consensus about how to specify the capacity for ought thought, I think, is not necessarily a cause for alarm all by itself. That just means some disagreement in the field. But I think where it really does get problematic is that then these theorists turn around and use the presence or absence of ought thought, as they have construed it, as a psychological criterion for identifying which effects are going to count as social norms and which ones aren't. So this is most obvious in the animal norms debate, but it's also evident in the theories of norms themselves, which begin their inquiry by setting out a distinctly psychological conception of what social norms are. namely the one that fits with their preferred framework for functional analysis. So at the same time that there is considerable disagreement about what the capacity for odd thought consists in, there's also this somewhat circular reliance upon that construct to define what social norms are in the first place. So this seems to get the cart before the horse. Instead of specifying the effects of interest on some independent basis, and then identifying the psychological capacity or capacities that give rise to them, norm theorists are in effect stipulating that their explananda, that is social norms, are just whatever is explained by their preferred explanands. So what I would argue here is that delineating the class of effects that we call social norms in terms of an underlying capacity for odd thought is premature. And that as much as it might be intuitive for us to think of social norms as having certain core or essential psychological features, whether that involves representations of rules or a particular affective phenomenology, that this is just actually not a productive point of departure for the cognitive science of social norms. And so instead, what we need to do is find some alternative way of talking about that class of effects that we're interested in explaining without taking their psychological properties for granted. Then once we've done that, and we can go out and we identify the relevant effects, then we can figure out which capacities are best suited to explain them. Now, there's actually a very nice precedent for this kind of pivot in a related literature, which is the study of animal culture. Now, as you may or may not know, discoveries of putatively cultural behaviors, in fact, abound across many non-human animal species, from the transmission of songs in birds, to potato washing in macaque monkeys, to tool use in chimpanzees. And especially in the case of great apes, many researchers have been interested in whether these behaviors can tell us anything about the evolution of cultural cognition in human beings. But initially, in what has become known as the chimpanzee culture wars, these debates were hamstrung by semantic disputes over the term culture, cultural cognition. In particular, several authors first attempted to define their explanandum in terms of certain psychological capacities involved in paradigmatic forms of human culture. For example, capacities like active teaching or imitation or perspective taking. This then led to years of tedious debates over whether or not certain putatively cultural behaviors in animals were really, in fact, the product of teaching or imitation, or if they couldn't be more parsimoniously explained by lower level processes like associative learning. But eventually people realized that the deeper problem here was that these definitions were already assuming too much about the psychological unity of human culture. Because while it might be the case that teaching or imitation or perspective taking do play a role in some forms of human cultural learning, other forms of our cultural cognition could just as easily arise from simpler and more widely shared processes. So there was no reason, in other words, to assume that cultural learning or cultural cognition really constitutes a discrete capacity or a natural psychological kind. However, as time went on, this assumption about the psychological unity of culture was increasingly abandoned in this literature. Instead, researchers shifted to a more psychologically neutral set of constructs that would allow them to first identify behavioral patterns of interest within an animal community, and then explore the psychological mechanisms that give rise to them. So in this spirit, one basic concept that was introduced was the notion of a tradition. So traditions are defined as behaviors that are shared by two or more individuals in a unit, that are acquired via social learning, and that are transmitted across generations. Culture is then defined in terms of traditions, namely as the possession of multiple traditions spanning different domains of behavior. And then at a third level, cumulative culture is defined as cultural traditions that have accumulated modifications over time, with successive additions building on earlier ones and making them more complex. So this framework has given animal culture researchers a very clear method for identifying their target explananda. And it's also had some very interesting implications for how we think about the evolution of human cultural cognition. For example, the philosopher Kim Sterelny has argued that even very simple processes like trial and error learning can, when suitably scaffolded by the environment, actually produce cumulative cultural adaptations over time. So what I want to suggest is that this field actually provides a nice model for the cognitive science of social norms. Once we pivot away from defining social norms based on idiosyncratic and controversial claims about their underlying psychology, and instead we focus on some of their more readily observable behavioral features, that can start to give us a relatively theory-neutral way of identifying the class of effects that the cognitive science of social norms is in the business of explaining. The trick here is going to be to articulate a psychologically neutral conception of what a social norm is. That still does a good job of capturing the effects that fall within the extension of this term as it's normally used. So on that note, I'm now going to introduce a new technical term here, normative regularities, which I'm defining as socially maintained patterns of behavioral conformity in a community. I'll explain a bit more what these terms mean in a moment, but for now, I want you to note right away that what I'm not doing here is giving a conceptual analysis or a definition of what we mean when we use the term social norm, or an attempt to spell out their necessary and sufficient conditions. In my view, I think that kind of project is likely to be unproductive. So instead, the purpose of this construct that I'm going to tell you about is going to be to give norms researchers an ecumenical way of talking about the effects that we normally call social norms without making strong assumptions about their psychology. So to achieve this result, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on some of the characteristic patterns of social interaction that make up social norms, instead of how social norms are instantiated in the heads of individuals. Okay, so let's break this down a bit more, and I'm going to say what these terms mean. So first, I take it that patterns of behavioral conformity is fairly intuitive. Social norms generally involve many individuals in a community, or perhaps a certain type of individuals, who are all generally doing the same stuff in similar situations. Like, for example, every Veterans Day in the United States, the US president will go out to Arlington Memorial Cemetery in Virginia and will lay out a wreath. So this is a feature that I think you can find in pretty much every theory of the psychology of norms that we've mentioned thus far, which suggests that there's a pretty general consensus that whatever social norms are, they're going to produce patterns of behavioral conformity. Now, one notable thing about this aspect of social norms is that it immediately distinguishes them from what you might call purely prescriptive norms that focus on ideals or standards that people don't actually achieve in practice very often. So while social norms do have a prescriptive flavor, the fact that they refer to these actual patterns of behavioral conformity show that they are also partly descriptive and statistical in nature. One way that I like to put it is that social norms refer to the way we do things around here. Of course, all of the theorists I'm talking about would also agree that social norms are not mere patterns of behavioral conformity. Now, to see what I mean by a mere pattern of behavioral conformity, take the following example. Suppose that there's one water fountain in the area and it's a hot day. And so what happens is that everyone who passes this water fountain is going to stop and get a drink. So here you go, you have a pattern of behavioral conformity. But intuitively, there is nothing particularly social about this pattern. And that's because all of these behaviors can be explained at the level of the individual, independent of any reference to social factors. So if there was just one individual in the area, they would still go ahead and take a drink just the same. So this is definitely not what we mean when we talk about social norms. Rather, norms theorists are interested in a particular subset of these patterns of behavioral conformity. Specifically, the patterns of behavioral conformity that we see in normative regularities cannot be explained solely at the level of the individual. Instead, I want to suggest that they are explained by the way that members of the community respond to each other in contexts of conformity and nonconformity. Another way of putting this is that conformity to social norms is usually a response to various forms of social pressure. So here, I'm going to introduce another technical term, social maintenance. Specifically, we're going to say that a pattern of behavioral conformity is socially maintained if and only if the presence of that pattern is explained by the fact that members of the community engage in behaviors that incentivize conformity and disincentivize nonconformity. With this definition in place, we can then further distinguish between two kinds of social maintenance behavior: negative social maintenance and positive social maintenance. So negative social maintenance is when a pattern of behavioral conformity is maintained by imposing costs on nonconformity. So the relevant behaviors here could include explicit forms of punishment of norm violators and physical violence, but also social costs like ostracism or social exclusion or gossip. Positive social maintenance, on the other hand, is when conformity to a regularity is incentivized by social rewards. So such rewards might include praise or gains in social status or social inclusion, or maybe just general forms of social fluency. Now, of these two constructs, negative social maintenance might initially seem a bit more familiar, because as we've noted, several theories of norms do accord a central role for punishment. However, having that positive social maintenance notion in the definition is actually going to turn out to be quite important. Because for one thing, it's going to give us a way to characterize and talk about normative regularities where deviations from the norm are in practice rare, and thus so are opportunities for punishment of norm violators. After all, you don't want to have a definition of normative regularities that precludes the possibility of a social norm that's never violated in practice. But also, more importantly, having this notion of positive social maintenance is going to allow us to capture some of the underlying processes that are emphasized by theorists who aren't necessarily assigning a central role to punishment, like in the sense of should model. Notice also that this conception of social maintenance does make some appeal to a few very basic psychological notions, namely incentives and rewards. But it doesn't make any strong claims about how the contents of these rewards or incentives or how they're cognitively implemented. And so this is what makes this definition minimally psychological rather than purely behavioral. So once we specify the class of effects that we're interested in this way as normative regularities, then the goal of the cognitive science of norms starts to shift somewhat. Now it looks like the job of cognitive scientists interested in studying social norms is to identify normative regularities out in the world, and then to go out and uncover the psychological processes that contribute to them. We could further break this down into two kinds of questions about processes that are driven by the actor and those that are driven by the audience. So on the actor side, we could ask what it is that motivates an individual to conform to a given normative regularity, and ideally use this as a way to eliminate the possibility that what we really have is a mere pattern of behavioral conformity. And then on the audience side, we can ask what kinds of processes are motivating individuals to respond positively to conformity and negatively to nonconformity. Now, once we frame the goal of the cognitive science of social norms in this way, something very interesting happens, which is that we open up the possibility that what we really have are many different capacities here. That is, that social norms are in fact realized by a whole variety of underlying cognitive, affective, and even ecological processes. So in other words, there might just simply be very many ways that we human beings do social norms. And also that there is interesting psychological variability across different social norms or across individuals participating in the same norm or in the same norm over time. So this amounts to a whole new empirical thesis about the cognitive architecture of social norms, a framework that Kristen Andrews and I call normative pluralism. So now what I want to do is briefly sketch out how such a pluralistic model of the cognitive science of social norms might look. First. Okay, so let's start on the actor side with the processes that contribute to social norm conformity. Now, we've already seen one mechanism like that, and that's Thoreau and colleagues' sense of should. So this process gives us one explanation for why people might be motivated to conform to a social norm, because doing so makes other people's behaviors more predictable. But even in contexts where nonconformity on the part of the actor would not give rise to unpredictable behavior in others, one might still be motivated to conform for other instrumental reasons. For example, avoiding very predictable forms of punishment, like when you violate the speeding limit and get a ticket, or seeking to benefit from the practical outcomes of social coordination. There is also no doubt some truth in Thomas Sello's account, which is that often conforming to social norms does allow us to participate in shared activities that can give us a rewarding sense of social identity. Like, for example, when you wear your team's jersey at a sports game. So already these processes we mentioned are going to look pretty different psychologically. They're going to involve different kinds of representations and inferences. And we wouldn't assume that they're all going to be the product of the same cognitive processes, the same basic kind of ought thought. Some of these processes are going to be quite explicit, some are going to be quite low level, but they're all going to be equally capable of producing the relevant kinds of behavioral conformity. So that's a sampling of the kind of processes that might motivate adherence to normative regularities on the actor side. But if we turn now to the audience side, we can first consider the case of negative social maintenance. And we can ask, what might motivate an individual to impose costs on those who fail to conform to social norms? Now, of course, there are many familiar motivations to engage in punishment at the level of explicit reasoning, consequentialist calculations about deterrence, or maybe beliefs about retribution. But notably, whether or not a person reasons about punishment in terms of deterrence or retribution already varies quite a bit, both across cultures and between individuals within a given culture. So already this explicitly motivated kind of negative social maintenance is quite pluralistic. In some contexts, punishment is also often used for pedagogical reasons, as a way of teaching norm violators how to behave in different situations. So in these cases, punishers are not actually treating the act of punishment as an end unto itself or as a means of deterrence. Rather, they view the sanction as effective only insofar as it communicates the right message to the norm violator. So this kind of social maintenance might thus be driven more by the kinds of psychological processes that we normally see underpinning Gricean communication. There is also some interesting research from Gillian Jordan at Harvard and David Rand at MIT, suggesting that we often use punishment of norm violators as a way of signaling our trustworthiness to others, and that we tend to punish norm violators less when we don't have an audience around, or if we found a way to signal our trustworthiness to our audience in some other way. And of course, there's always second-party forms of punishment or retaliation, like when a norm violation directly harms our material interests, as when we might shout at someone who's jumped the queue ahead of us. So these retaliatory behaviors can also serve as a mechanism for stabilizing a normative regularity, just like playing tit for tat in an iterated prisoner's dilemma might stabilize cooperation. Now, as previously noted, positive social maintenance refers to behaviors that support normative regularities by rewarding conformity. So one clear example of this is explicit praise for conformity, like when we praise our children for minding their manners or doing their chores. So this too can be understood in pedagogical and communicative terms. A more subtle form of positive social maintenance is when we respond positively to other norm conformers, because norm conformity functions as a kind of ethnic marker of who is a potential cooperative partner. Now, one example of this that I like as a Canadian is when we Canadians are traveling abroad and we put maple leaf flags on our backpack. And so that way, whenever we see another person with a maple leaf flag, we know that we found a potential friend, maybe a traveling partner with whom we can share all our love of all things Canadian. Then there's what you might think of as the counterpart to the sense of should model, which is that when other people are conforming to their expectations, when they're not surprising us, they're going to create fewer prediction errors. And so that theory actually predicts that reliable norm conformers should generate a kind of positive affect that increases social fluency, so that we just feel a little bit more nice and relaxed around people who are behaving as we expect them to behave. So here again, we have this wide range of psychological processes that all contribute to the positive and negative maintenance of social norms. Now, importantly, this kind of pluralistic approach to the psychology of social norms can also help us to see how even very simple and very evolutionarily widespread cognitive processes can potentially give rise to quite stable normative regularities. So consider the possibility of a normative regularity that arises entirely via reinforcement. So take, for example, the familiar choice of whether or not to stand still or keep moving forward when you are on an escalator. Now, initially, the reward value of the cost of benefits of these two types of action types might be equivalent. So you might choose more or less at random. But if other people around you on the escalator are moving and you're standing still, you're going to be in their way. And so you're going to start to get some negative feedback. They're going to bump into you. Maybe they're going to give you dirty looks, which you're going to experience as aversive. And that's going to start to function as a kind of social maintenance. It's going to lead you to assign a lower value to standing still than to moving, and you're going to start moving as well, thus conforming to the normative regularity. Now, importantly, at no point in this process would you ever need to explicitly represent or be motivated by a rule, like keep moving when you're on the escalator. Rather, all you need to do is store a map of the reward structure of that particular environment, and that can be enough to drive the social norm. An additional interesting possibility here is that a normative regularity might initially be established in this implicit manner, and then later come to be explicitly represented as a rule in the minds of certain individuals, perhaps one that they learn through mentalistic inference or through language. So you might have the same normative regularity underwritten by different cognitive processes at different points in time in the heads of different individuals. Lastly, we could even consider the role that niche construction might play in incentivizing norm conformity, and how the structure of the built environment itself might constitute an indirect form of social maintenance. So think, for example, of a ski hill and the prohibition against skiing out of bounds. Now, there are some pretty explicit forms of negative social maintenance driving conformity to this norm, like fines or stern warnings from ski patrol. But then there's also the fact that the ski hill has actually been intentionally designed by other agents so that skiing within bounds is nice and easy. After all the runs are nicely groomed, there aren't too many trees, it's safe, they all lead to places you want to go, like the chalet or the parking lot. And meanwhile, skiing out of bounds is dangerous and messy. So in a very real way, the social maintenance of this norm has been partially offloaded onto the environment through the use of intentional design. Another example of this might be when we paint lines on the road to encourage drivers to stick to their designated lanes. Now, note here, I'm not claiming that normative pluralism is an inevitable consequence of my methodological proposal to adopt this minimally psychological conception of social norms, or as I've been calling them, normative regularities. I think that even if norm theorists did adopt this approach, methodological approach, we might still discover that, hey, maybe there really is a core capacity here, or a norm system, or a central mechanism that explains most human social norms. But I do think that adopting this minimally psychological conception of norms is going to create the space for a pluralistic account, where I don't think that there was one before. And once that pluralistic option is on the table, I also believe that explaining all of the variability between different human social norms in terms of one core types of capacity is going to start to look considerably less plausible. Now, one important practical upshot of this approach will then be that theorists should probably restrict the scopes of their generalizations about the psychology of norms, and perhaps even approach different norms on a case-by-case basis. Now, one objection that I've gotten to this view is that, as defined, my notion of a normative regularity is way too broad. That is, you might think that without any specific psychological requirements for having a social norm, you're going to end up with cases of normative regularities appearing in places where intuitively they shouldn't be. So one potential example of this is the phenomenon of marching bands in Mormon crickets. This is a phenomenon you get in the American West, in states like Utah, where you have millions and millions of these insects lining up in these surprisingly evenly spaced formations. that can stretch 10 miles long, and they march across the countryside. Notably, the social maintenance mechanism in this pattern of behavioral conformity is cannibalism, because the crickets are maintaining formation because they're simultaneously running away from the protein and salt-starved cricket behind them, while at the same time hungrily chasing the tasty protein and salt snack that's fleeing up ahead. So obviously, this is a very different set of psychological processes than the ones that are driving us when we're lining up at the airport. And so you might wonder if lumping these two kinds of phenomena in the same category is going to amount to some kind of reductio of the view. But as it happens, I'm quite sensitive to the fact that this notion of normative regularities casts a wide net. And indeed, this is by design in our attempt to be ecumenical. But at the same time, I recognize there might be good reasons to want some finer grained way of carving up the empirical territory. But nevertheless, I think that this notion of normative regularities is still going to be useful as a kind of conceptual building block, not unlike the way that traditions serve as a conceptual building block in the animal culture literature that I mentioned earlier. So how might we use normative regularities as a building block in order to achieve more fine-grained distinctions? Well, one strategy might be to further distinguish between different types of social maintenance. For example, we might distinguish between regularities that persist after social maintenance behaviors cease and regularities that require continuous social maintenance, what you might call persistent versus transient normative regularities. So this could be a minimally psychological way of capturing the notion of an internalized social norm. Another approach might be to distinguish between normative regularities, where the relevant social maintenance behaviors are themselves the product of social maintenance, or strong normative regularities. That is, where making others conform is itself positively or negatively incentivized. So these are just a few tentative proposals, but the point here is to illustrate how you can develop increasingly stringent conceptions of what social norms are, all while still maintaining this minimally psychological approach without taking for granted some controversial conception of ought thought. And then for each of these constructs, cognitive scientists can go out, identify the relevant behaviors, and then empirically investigate what kinds of mechanisms produce them. Now, one other objection that's come up when presenting this model is that it leads to a kind of eliminativism. Because if it turns out that social norms are just so heterogeneous that they don't share any psychological features in common, then maybe we just shouldn't employ the concept of social norms in cognitive science at all. We should turf it. Now, this complaint has some merit, as I am, in fact, skeptical that we are going to find any universal psychological generalizations about social norms, or that they constitute some kind of natural psychological kind. So what I'm offering here is a kind of deflationary approach. But I also think that we can very safely be instrumentalists about social norms as an empirical construct, much in the same way that Daniel Dennett's intentional stance theory is instrumentalist about beliefs and desires and propositional attitudes. Because as I've noted, identifying a pattern of social behavior within a community as a social norm does allow us to make some fairly robust predictions and generalizations about behavior in that domain, even if we don't know quite why these predictions and generalizations work. And moreover, identifying something as a social norm is going to highlight it as a phenomenon that we need to, as an explananda for further empirical investigation. And so if we happen to learn over the course of that investigation that there's lots of psychological heterogeneity underlying one psychological norm or the other, well, I think that's actually going to be pretty interesting and valuable information. In fact, it might even be that psychological differences across different social norms are really the more interesting story here. For example, if we need to appeal to some variability in normative cognition, we may need to appeal to some variability in normative cognition in order to explain why there are certain cultural differences in what the psychologist Michelle Gelfand has called normative tightness and looseness. So in her research, she's found that people in different cultures actually vary in terms of their overall sensitivity to norms and the strictness of their enforcement. And so pluralism could be really useful in explaining this. Pluralism can also be useful in thinking about individual differences in normative cognition. and how they relate to processes of norm change. For example, when explaining Christina Bicchieri's notion of trendsetter individuals who are able to start new norms in their community because they're insensitive to the social pressure to maintain current ones. On the other hand, pluralism could also help us to explain the robustness of certain normative regularities. Because quite plausibly, the fact that a given normative regularity can be realized by many different underlying processes can help us to explain why it remains stable despite variability in the motivations of the individuals participating in it. So thus construed normative regularities might function like equifinal attractor points within a broader space of behavioral possibilities. So to summarize, what I've argued here is that existing models of the cognitive science of social norms see themselves as giving a functional analysis of a species typical capacity for thought. However, there is just very little consensus about how this capacity should be characterized, and yet it is regularly invoked to delineate which effects are social norms and which ones aren't. And so what I propose is that we should instead adopt this minimally psychological conception of social norms, what I've called normative regularities. And I've argued that this methodological shift is also going to open up a space for an empirical proposal that the psychology of social norms is quite heterogeneous, which I've called normative pluralism. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for your attention. These are some of my collaborators and some of my funders. So I appreciate you. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Evan, for this wonderful talk. Great. So now we have about an hour of Q&A, and there's two methods you can ask questions. You can either write something in the chat box, or you can raise your hand on the reactions button. Both are fine. If you write something in the chat box, then I'm just going to read out the question to Evan that you're gonna pose. All right. So we have an hour for questions. Okay, we have a question by Wu Yu. Okay, I seem not to be able to unmute. Okay, great.
Could you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you for your very interesting lecture. I have two questions. The first one concerns the concept of outthought, and according to you, the outthought causes our social norms, and it is also explains the social norms. So I'm confused about, is there any differentiation between this cause and its explanations? And the question will focus on the what is the outthought? If it is just a psychological term, does that mean it's some neural circuit in our brain or something else? This is the first one. The second one, okay, you could answer that.
I'll answer the first one first. So the term thought is a term that I've kind of introduced to capture what it is that a lot of these other norm theorists are sort of positing, what they're positing to explain social norms. They think that there's going to be something in the head, some capacity, something that some psychological capacity that explains why we conform to social norms, why we enforce them upon each other, and how we learn them. And so I've kind of labeled that capacity as thought. And each of them kind of has a different idea about what this thing is, what thought is. And some of them do explain it kind of at the level of beliefs and desires. Some have a kind of more neural explanation at different levels. But importantly, each of these different conceptions of thought is very is very different. And so this is kind of what gives rise to this fragmentation problem. And what I've kind of tried to argue is like, well, there isn't any one thing that is ought thought. Instead, what you have are these social norms, these kind of patterns of behavior, and then you just have all kinds of different psychological processes that explain them. And for each social norm, the process is going to be a little bit different. So there's not going to be one explanation, one thing, one kind of ought thought that explains all these different cases.
Okay, thank you. The second one, I'm very interested in the that the people are talking about is there any social norm in chimpanzee or the other animals? They may be able to use tools or learn some numbers, but they might lack of signifying or abstracting function or process. For human behavior. It is for human behavior, the main characteristic might be the symbolic and expressive. If there is space in social norms for communications, shall we consider about the problem of expression and signification implicit in them?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that this is what the debate about whether or not there are social norms in non-human animals like chimpanzees, I think it really brings to light this problem, this basic problem that I'm trying to point out in this paper, which is that, well, depending on how you kind of understand the mental requirements for social norms in human beings, that is going to sort of set the bar either very high or a bit lower for what it would take for a non-human animal to have social norms. So, for example, if you thought that having language was a prerequisite for having social norms, well, then by definition, you would not have these in you would not have social norms in non-human animals or in chimpanzees. But if, on the other hand, you thought that it was something like this sense of should, this kind of emotional process, this affective process, well, that probably is something that you could have in non-human primates, because it's a much more basic and simple process. And so what happens is in these debates is that some researchers come in and they say, here's this behavior in chimpanzees, and we think that this behavior is maybe like an evolutionary precursor to social norms in human beings, or we think that this is a kind of non-human social norm. But then they can't, and then others say, no, it isn't. But then it turns out that they don't agree about what ought thought is. They don't have this shared conception of ought thought. And so it's a very potent illustration of the sort of the mess in this area.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, some people might still think of questions. Meanwhile, I might ask one myself. Yeah, Evan, I was wondering what your final goal is in putting forth this thesis about sort of norm minimalism. So there's a bunch of things I could sort of, if you ask me what your goal was, there's a bunch of things I might say. So the first thing I might say is, well, that you view all these competitor accounts as ways to explain what norms are, but the definition of norms is much more sparse. Another way to put what's going on is to say that these other competing views, they they also they are part of what the definition of norms, and yet there is sort of a common core that you have described, but the full definition of norms needs sort of this extra ingredient, and maybe there's a couple of extra ingredients. There's not a single one. But the difference in these two ways of putting it would be that, well, on the first view, one could say, well, Evan, you have given a definition of norms, while on the other view, one would say, no, I've just given the core, and the actual definition is sort of pluralistic and disjunctive, and so on. So the question, which project do you have?
So the way I see the project, in a way, it's meant to be quite practical. In fact, some of these people I had on the last slide who are my collaborators are people who are actually trying to study the cognitive science of social norms in humans and in animals. And so in a way, what we want to do is develop a sort of way of talking about social norms, where a way of talking about and identifying behaviors that we call social norms out there in the world, that in a way that doesn't presuppose a particular psychological theory, a particular conception of what ought thought is. And so the idea is by remaining psychologically neutral, that can allow us to then offer different explanations of the same phenomenon. Instead of building one particular conception of what social norms are into the explananda. And but I mean, to answer your question, the way I see it is I'm looking at this sort of from the outsider. I'm a philosopher, and I'm seeing, okay, what are all of these scientists doing? What are they all trying to do? What are they all talking about? And what is the sort of model of explanation that they're employing? How do these projects, these different theories relate to one another? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of come in as a philosopher of science from the outside, and I'm going to kind of articulate, well, here's the sort of broad explananda. It's these normative regularities. And then I'm noting that each of these like neuroscientists and psychologists and philosophers, what they're doing is they each have different construals of that explananda. And those construals depend on a kind of assumption, a certain essentializing about what it is about what social norms are, that there's a certain kind of psychological essence, this ought thought underlying. And so I'm kind of questioning that assumption by offering this pluralistic model, but I'm also saying, okay, here's what, but I'm also offering a kind of path for how you can kind of translate across these theories that otherwise seem like they're using kind of just theory internal vocabularies. And that's in a way what, one of the project that I'm on, as I said, is to actually develop a set of methodological recommendations for this debate about studying social norms in non-human animals. And so the thing that I'm working with Kristen Andrews and Simon Fitzpatrick and some of these other people is actually to say, okay, so if you're going to ask this question about animals, here's a way of kind of coordinating on our terms. Here's a way of sort of defining what social norms are. And we actually have a bunch of primate researchers who are on board and contributing to it so that we can sort of make progress in this field. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does definitely answer a lot of it. I was just not super clear on what these other people are also trying to do. So it seems like your strategy was going to be something like, well, all these people, they add a lot of sort of what it is to explain a social norm into the definition of a social norm, and that's sort of illegitimate. And there's some more kind of sparse characterization of social norms that is adequate, whatever that means. But it seems to me that people like we carry the other conceptions I don't really know too well, but it never seemed to me that they are adding what they think is part of the explanation of a social norm importing it into its definition, but rather they're thinking, well, if there's no special extra ingredient and everyone sort of disagrees of what that extra special ingredient is, then the definition of social norms is going to be too broad. It's going to be too sparse. And a lot of things that we don't intuitively want to count as social norms are going to be admitted. You were mentioning sort of the cricket example, and it seems to me that part of the motivation to kind of add a little bit more richness to those definitions is in order to exclude those sorts of examples.
Right.
So for Bikari, then there's reciprocal expectations, and that obviously rules out the crickets.
Yeah. And so what I'm kind of pushing, my kind of response to that concern is that there are ways of ruling out the crickets, of kind of narrowing your focus without stipulating, okay, well, social norms, the things that we call social norms, are just going to be this particular kind of psychological the things that are produced by this psychological process. Mm-hmm. So for Bikari, it's having empirical expectations and normative expectations. Mm-hmm. And this is important for two reasons. One is because, I mean, just empirically, it can be quite difficult to figure out, okay, what's which psychological process is actually causing someone to engage in a particular kind of behavioral conformity. Like people can conform for all, so say it's like lining up for standing in line. Maybe you stand in line because it's a social norm, maybe because you're worried about being punished if you don't, maybe it's just because you believe it's fair, or maybe it's just a habit and you don't think about it at all. And this is in fact true. So this is true, I think, across the board, that when you see social norms, they're this kind of collective, social, interactive phenomenon where you have many people all kind of engaging in roughly the same behavior. And there are, and it's just totally plausible that each person is doing it for their own reasons and these different sets of reasons. And so if what you want to explain is, hey, why are people lining up at the grocery store? Or why are people engaging in this particular kind of conformity? Well, you shouldn't frame it so that, like, okay, it's only social norms if everybody is doing it because they have these particular kinds of odd thoughts, and otherwise it's something else. Instead, it's saying, okay, so here's this thing we've identified, it's this target of explanation as a social norm. Now let's go and figure out what are the psychological factors that bring about this kind of collective result. Mm-hmm. And that could actually turn out to be quite diverse. And it might be really interesting to learn about that diversity. Mm-hmm. Instead of assuming that, like, the only kind of explanation you can give for that pattern of conformity is going to be one where it's going to be one that appeals to a core capacity.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you. Okay, other questions from the audience? Again, I'll wait a little bit.
I was just so clear in my talk that no one has any questions. Everyone is convinced.
I do have more questions, Evan. I don't want to storm ahead with asking them all. I want to give others a chance. Just as a reminder to everybody else in the audience, if you do have a question but you don't feel entirely comfortable speaking, then you can always write your question in the chat box, and then I'll just read it out to Evan. Okay, I'll just keep asking some questions. So I have two examples for you. The first example about your theory being too narrow, and the other example about your theory being too broad. And I would love to hear how you respond to this. So the first example, addresses your punishment criterion for in your definition. You said that punishment is in some sense required for social norms. Here's an example. Suppose there's an airport with a hall, and everyone who enters the airport goes along some sort of yellow line, follows some yellow line to like the check-in, let's say. However, if there's another check-in, let's say over there, where there's no yellow line, and because there's a yellow line, everyone just like follows the yellow line. So there's a lot of conformity there. But if people were to deviate from that line, no one would do anything. People would just, that would be completely fine. There would be no sanctioning mechanism whatsoever. And the reason why people walk along this line is not that they are that they're going to be punished, but rather because they fear, or maybe just because they walk along this line because it's salient in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think about those sorts of behaviors?
So first, a slight correction in that it's not that I think that punishment is necessary, or that it's and I use this term social maintenance. And social maintenance is basically conformity has to be incentivized by the behavior of others. And that can be negative, like punishment, like you sort of disincentivize nonconformity, costs on nonconformity, but it can also be rewards for conformity. And crucially, these costs and rewards have to come from the behavior of others in the community. Now, the case that you're describing, it sounds like there isn't social maintenance. It sounds a bit more like the water fountain case, because if people are just following the line because it's salient and because it's there, and if there was just one person, they were just following it all the same. If you can kind of explain this behavior entirely at the individual level, and the behavior of others, of other individuals, doesn't factor in the explanation of any given individual's conformity, then it's actually going to be a mere pattern of behavioral conformity, and it's not going to count as a normative regularity.
Okay, I understand that. One little addition to the example. What if what if, for example, people fear that they're going to be punished, but there is no such mechanism in place? So there's no social maintenance, but there's just a representation of it. How is that figuring your theory?
So I think that they have to learn that. They have to kind of learn that. They have to acquire that expectation from somewhere. And so, if they acquired it because, like, at some point in the past there was a cost employed, there was a negative response, or that there was a negative response in a similar situation previously, like, this is going to be you're going to have, in this case, social maintenance is going to sort of occur in the past in this learning story, as part of the learning story. And there it's going to become what I called this persistent social norm rather than a transient social norm, in the sense that you don't have to have active social maintenance in order for the regularity to persist. You just need some kind of social maintenance at some point earlier in the past, where that has to do with some kind of acquisition process. And so the relevant social maintenance there is going to be something in the learning story.
If I just may push back just a tiny bit there, it seems to me that when people expect to be punished, right? Then suppose there's this behavioral pattern, people expect to be punished. Wouldn't you say that that's enough? And then, so there's a very strong pattern because everyone expects to be punished, like a lot, let's say. Can you observe that pattern? It seems like you can observe that pattern and judge right away that this is a social norm. You wouldn't really have to ask further questions, or I guess I'm asking you what do you think about it. It seems to me that you wouldn't necessarily have to ask further questions of how that expectation came about. So if it had happened that the entire society had sort of formed at random, sort of swampman style, then you would probably also judge for this sort of phenomenon to be a social norm. And I'm asking this also because of sort of the way Bikieri puts these things, that in a lot of cases, social norms tend to be stable, not because a violation would incur any adverse effects, but just because of weird reciprocal expectations people have. I guess for Bikieri, the point is that a lot of social norms can stay in place way beyond their social utility just because people have the wrong expectations about each other. And so in this particular case, you might think that social norms can be in place because people expect to be punished where there is no such punishment, and that sort of is constitutively enough for a social norm to be in place.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that there are going to be, like, part of a pluralistic model is to say that there are going to be all kinds of psychological processes, all kinds of beliefs people can have, all kinds of expectations and stuff that can give rise to these patterns. Mm-hmm. And so Bikieri has kind of identified a subset. She's identified a subset, and but the to kind of address, but the one important point is that, like, you know, when we're talking about a community level phenomenon, like, mm-hmm. why are all these people conforming? And then what Bikieri is given is a sort of, okay, well, here's a kind of pattern of beliefs that each individual might share that would give rise to that. Here's an idealization. Suppose everyone had this set of beliefs, and then that would give rise to that norm. Well, what I'm saying is that you could actually have a lot more heterogeneity mm-hmm. within that community, within the psychological processes giving rise to it. And that it would still look like a norm. It would still look like the same behavior that we would still seek an explanation for. Mm-hmm. But that, you know, once you accept that point, it makes a little bit less sense to sort of start out by stipulating, well, here's how social norms work. It's when people have these particular this particular pattern of conditional social preferences. And so you need a conception of social norms that isn't going to take for granted that a kind of psychological homogeneity in all of its participants. You need some other conception, and so normative regularities is one way of talking about it. But, you know, I admit it's very tricky. It's very tricky to find to sort of find the right way of capturing it at the group level. But I think the solution is not going to be to sort of essentialize it. But I should stop because I see we have some questions in the chat.
Let me read out some of the questions. I'll just go in order, right? Sure. So the first question is by Lili Lu, and the question is, so can we say that this is also a new framework for mind shaping?
Yes, thank you. Excellent question. So I'll just, for some people in the audience who are not familiar with the term mind shaping, it's a great connection. So mind shaping is refers to, it's this term that was introduced, I think, by Tad Zawitsky, and it's meant to be a contrast with mind reading, where mind reading is when we sort of, the way that we coordinate with other people in our community is by inferring what they think and by sort of predicting their behavior on the basis of inferences about what they think. Mind shaping is that the way that we are able to coordinate and get along in the social environment is not by sort of making inferences about what other people think, but by sort of, but by shaping, by regulating their behavior. And so we do things like punishment, we do things like reward, praise, and blame, are ways of shaping other people's behavior, other people's minds, so that they are more predictable. And so it's a very good connection to draw with this research on social norms, because social maintenance is in fact a kind of mind shape. It sort of echoes this idea of mind shaping. The idea is that the sort of patterns of conformity, these very predictable patterns of conformity that we see in a population, are in a way the result of mind shaping. So you could actually think of social maintenance, the social maintenance component of my definition of normative regularities, as mind shaping activity, very broadly construed. So that's an excellent connection to draw. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lili Lu. Let me read another question to Evan. I wonder, is there any effective psychology model could help us dealing with some paradoxes like Wittgenstein and its modern elucidation?
So I think this is a very good connection as well. Specifically with respect to Wittgenstein and some of like the debate, the sort of post-Wittgensteinian debates about rule following. So Wittgenstein sort of, and then later Kripke interpreting very famously had this point about how you kind of, it can be very difficult to know what rule a person is following just on the basis of their behavior. And there's a certain kind of indeterminacy from behavior alone, what psychological rule people are following to produce it. And so this is also very true of social norms, that if we have in a sense, you can look at a pattern of behavior, you can say, oh, everyone's following a rule. You can describe a pattern, a social norm out in the community as a rule. But that actually, the fact that you can describe it as a rule underdetermines what psychological processes are giving rise to. And so it can be that, like, while there's a sense in which we as theorists can say, everyone is following this norm and we specify it, it can still be that all of the individuals participating in it are following a different rule in their heads, are following a different rule, or maybe the same individual is following a different rule at different points in time. And it still gives rise to that same broad pattern of behavioral conformity. And so the sort of connection with Wittgenstein really, in a sense, illustrates the limitations of a psychological, of like stipulating a purely psychological conception of what it is to have a norm, or what it is to sort of be motivated by a norm, or what it is for a norm to be sort of active and instantiated in the population.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's just go down the list. Excuse me. Next question is by Wang Yuqing. Is a theory of mind a necessary prerequisite for having a sense of should?
So this is also a very good question. And I would definitely, if you're interested in the sense of should, I would encourage you to read the paper of that by that same name by Jordan Thoreau, Leanne Young, and Lisa Feldman Barrett. And it does sound like a theory of mind, right? Because the idea is that you are sort of making an inference about what other people expect you to do. And then you are behaving in a way that other people expect you to behave. That sounds very much like having a theory of mind. However, the authors, as a matter of fact, are very careful not to say that it involves a theory of mind. And I've spoken with Jordan Thoreau a number of times about this, because this is sort of how I read that theory as well. And he has a rather complicated answer, which is roughly along the lines of like, you have to be sensitive to other people's expectations in order to have a sense of should. So there's a sense in which like there's a sense in which you need to kind of track other people's expectations. But that doesn't mean for them that you need to represent them as such, that you need to sort of attribute a propositional mental state of like having an expectation to them in order to have the sense of should. They think that it can be a lot simpler. In some ways, it bears a resemblance to the distinction between tracking mental states and representing mental states as such that some authors like Stephen Butterfield have drawn. So now that is not necessarily a very convincing response to this question. And it might be that actually the best interpretation of the sense of should is that it involves the theory of mind, though the authors would disagree. So that is a complicated answer to a complicated question. But so Jordan would say no. I would probably say maybe yes.
Okay. I should emphasize that if you want to respond to what Evan said in response to your question, you can also chime in, turn on your microphone, and respond and ask a follow-up question to Evan.
Or in the chat is fine too.
Or in the chat is fine. Yeah. Then we can still field those kinds of follow-ups as well. If there's still residual confusion left. But if this is not the case right now, also, yeah, so for the previous questions, still think about it. We can still read the chat and field those follow-up questions. Last question for now in the chat. Sometimes we may find that many people have an urge to disobey the social norms. For example, fanatical criminals, punks. Is this a complete different form of cognitive process, or can it be put in your framework of normative regularity?
This is a very good question because one of, I think, the advantages of the pluralistic framework is it draws attention to the fact that for any given social norm, you might have individual variation in the psychological processes that people bring to bear when they participate. So I might participate in normative regularity for one reason. Julius might do it, participate for another, and so on. And so a part of what pluralism is interested in explaining is the sort of potential for individual variability and conformity. And part of that story is also going to be individual variability in nonconformity. And so it might be that say that Julius and I are both lining up at the grocery store, but Julius, who's a very moral person, does it because he believes this is fair. He believes it's fair. Whereas I do it only if I fear punishment. So we're both doing it for kind of different sets of beliefs. And so it might be that then you see that I might be much more likely to deviate from the norm than Julius is, because the kind of psychological process that he brings to bear on the social norm is more stable and more reliable than mine is. And so that starts to give you a story about why it might be important to have a pluralistic approach. And now, the cases that are raised in the comments, like criminals, punks and stuff, you might see them as being sort of much less, I mean, clearly these are going to be individuals who are less sensitive to norms and, or, I mean, in some cases with punks, it might be that they're really following a different set of norms because they're sort of part of a different community that distinguishes itself, differentiates itself by following a different set of norms or has a norm of violating other norms. So I mean, this is kind of how I would start to talk about it in the framework. One thing I'll mention here is, I mentioned it briefly at the end of the chat, Christina Bicchieri actually has this notion in her theory of what she calls her theory of norm change, a type of individual she calls a trendsetter. And so a trendsetter is an individual who is at once very insensitive to social norms, doesn't care about what other people think, but who is also very socially influential, where a lot of people care about what that individual does. And so a trendsetter is uniquely positioned to be at the one to deviate from norms and to have other people follow in their example and then set off a cascade of norm change. And so this is a very interesting kind of individual who might disobey social norms, where partly it has to do with their psychology, the fact that they don't care about what other people think. Maybe they sort of are less disposed to make inferences about other people's expectations. And on the other hand, it's also defined by their position in society, that other people have a bunch of attitudes towards them and want to emulate them. And so Bicchieri, in a way, is going to have a story for this kind of, for explaining this kind of variability. But I think it's the kind of story that's quite amenable within the pluralistic framework.
Great, Evan. Thank you for your answer. Again, if you have a follow-up question on this, please use the chat or turn on your mic to ask it. Maybe I'll wait for just a few seconds to see whether there's more audience questions. Okay. Well, while the audience is still thinking about asking further what other questions they might want to ask, let me give you my second example that I was thinking of.
Okay, sure.
So I was thinking maybe it's a bit contrived, but you were talking about the person drinking at the water fountain, and so there's no punishment and there's not a social phenomenon, right? But in this minimalist sense, social phenomenon, if we don't think of it as people representing that they are together and so on and so forth, which we don't want to do because of this minimalist framework, it just kind of means many people doing stuff, right? And here's the example that respects these sorts of parameters. Suppose there's many people consecutively going to the water fountain, right? They all drink, but they don't know that there's other people still. It's just one by one, each goes to the water fountain, maybe each one thinking that they're the only one. And if they drink only for a certain amount of time, let's say 5 seconds, a certain mechanism is triggered such that people get like splashed with water, and which can be avoided if people drink for longer than like 5 seconds, if they have a proper, if they drink properly for like 10 seconds. So everyone learns this over time, that there's a mechanism, and if they drink, they have to drink for at least 10 seconds or at least 5 seconds. So in which case, drinking for a shorter amount of time is punished, and it is, in this minimalist sense, a social phenomenon, because it's many people doing it, even if they don't know that many people are doing it. Each person thinks they're the only one. It seems to me that you would have to say that there's a social norm for that everyone drink longer than 5 seconds or something like that. What would you?
Wait, so let me ask you about the mechanism here. So the mechanism, what causes the mechanism to go off?
It's just something in the fountain. Like if
it has nothing to do with what other people do?
No, it's literally just a defect in the fountain that gets sort of neutralized if there's a longer than 5 second water stream, let's say. But if it's if there's no such water stream, it will splash you.
Okay, so that isn't socially maintained. That's just maintained by the mechanism, the fountain. Now, if like if we were to further contrive the example so that maybe as all the other people waiting for the water fountain become impatient, they stomp on the ground, which causes some reverberation, which eventually causes the splash. And then that would maybe be a kind of indirect social maintenance. But I mean, here's the thing is the definition, the term social maintenance, it's supposed to be broad. It's supposed to pick up, it's supposed to scoop up all kinds of different kinds of processes. And, you know, in a way, what I say, like what I said a bit at the end and what end of the talk and what I say in the paper is, look, if you're interested in a more restrictive phenomenon, here's my challenge to you, is come up with a way of describing that phenomenon that doesn't take for granted a specific psychological conception of thought. Find a way of doing it in minimally psychological terms. And this is for, and the purpose of this challenge, this is a methodological constraint because it helps them sort of not take for granted, not sort of stipulate that the behaviors they want to explain are just the things that their theory, as I said, that their explanans is just whatever is explained by their, or sorry, their explananda is just whatever is explained by their explanans. Mm-hmm. You know, so you need to have a different vocabulary for talking about the thing you're going to explain and the explanation. You need a different vocabulary for it. And so, you know, with these kind of minimal cases like this, I mean, what I talk about with the and the reason I bring up the crickets case is, you know, if a cognitive scientist isn't interested in that, fine, but they just need to have, my sort of challenge for them, sort of methodological challenge, is for them to not fall into this trap of taking a certain psychology of norms for granted.
Mm-hmm. Right, I understand. Mm-hmm. Thank you. That helps a lot with understanding your view. Okay, we have a few more minutes for questions.
I think we have one more hand in the.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have one more hand.
Oh yeah, Xinwei. I asked him to unmute. Okay, great.
Hi, good morning here. Sorry, I think my camera has a problem, but my name is Yimei. I'm with the Berger Institute at the PKU, and I might have been, you know, I was late for your presentation, but the whole thing is that I actually wonder, how do you think of the relations among all those social norms we're talking about? Like, do we taking them as a linear, like, do we prioritize some and like making some others in a later like a lower priority, or we could have some like, you know, kind of rather paradoxical, you know, dynamics among them, like in terms of how to say, when we try to really manage or you know, having a good ultimate result for societal progress, like how do we you know, handle the relationship among them? And for example, like just as we're speaking, like right now Beijing, that every single one of us in Beijing is almost need to do this PCR test for COVID every single day, and we all need to queue for that. So the norm obviously is like you queue for it, you stay in line, you stay 2 meters apart. Everyone is following the order and scanning, register, and do the test, and no crowds, no, you know, all of this. But things will happen in the sense like there will always be, you know, old people, seniors, children, or people don't have ID card, or, you know, a different type of troubles. And those people are just naturally jumping into the line. There was no assumptions for they have no concern. It's not that I believe it's not that they have different cognitive process, but somehow they just not really concerned about the actual queue or the needs that we need to separate certain space. So with those things happening, like how do we prioritize? How do we really, conceal ourselves basically within those situations?
If I can ask just to clarify, so when you're asking how do we prioritize, are you sort of asking a kind of descriptive question of like how psychologically do individuals sort of decide which norm to follow, or is it kind of more of a normative question of like how should we prioritize?
I suppose, yeah, prioritize in terms of like how do we act, how do we as individuals prioritize within the situations, and also collectively. When it's coming to this topic that we're talking about for social norms, like how can we have more people on board for the same, normative?
Yeah.
Does it make sense? Yeah.
Good.
Yes. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. And so in a way, this is sort of some theories of the cognitive science of norms, especially Becky-Aries, are really trying to kind of offer answers to these kinds of questions. They want to say, okay, how can we get people to conform to the right social norms? How can we get people to abandon harmful social norms? And she offers her framework, theory of the psychology of norms, as a way to, actually design like policy interventions, like try to get, she has worked with the UN on open defecation practices in some places and trying to intervene on those. And so there's a sense in which like the ambition of her view and of some of these other theories of norms is that once we understand the psychology of norms, we can start to actually do norm change, and we can do policy interventions, and we can nudge people towards having certain behaviors, towards the appropriate behaviors. Now, one kind of pessimistic implication of my view is that if pluralism is right, and if in fact people conform to norms for all kinds of different reasons, then that kind of project is going to be much more difficult. And I'll type her name in the chat right away.
Thank you so much. I definitely want to do some follow-up reading on this.
Yeah,
but here,
she has like, 2 books. Go ahead.
Oh, no, just like your talk really got me thinking, because I myself has a background in being organizational behaviors. So when we're talking about management methods, like we really think of this, we want to get an answer, we want to get a way to do it, and like really have results in terms of turning into organizational profit or utility-wise making more sense. But I think most of the time that people forgot to really think, what would be the cultural or the philosophical foundation, like why certain people act certain ways. And yeah, it's just I guess. Yeah, continue. I don't want to interrupt you, actually. Thank you, Ellen.
Oh, no, not at all. I was just going to say Christina Becky-Aries' recent book is Norms in the Wild. And that's a good one to check out if you're interested in her work. But yeah, I mean, this is, like I said, this is the ambition of this area of cognitive science, that there are a lot of that it has implications for international development, for organizational behavior. My colleague at Purdue University, Dan Kelly, is writing about how we can use the psychology of norms to help people to address climate change, and I, in a way, because I think that the construct of social norms and the psychology of norms, I think it's a really messy construct. And I think that it is just highly pluralistic and heterogeneous. And so, in a way, I might say, that those efforts are going to be very hard, and they might have to cope with, if they approach it in the sort of manner that I recommend on a more case-by-case basis, it might be very slow going before it works. Because so unfortunately, I have no solutions to offer to these questions, in this way, my theory is quite pessimistic.
Yes, well, thank you. I think like giving a thought is already like very important on this. But I wonder actually if you have thought of like, you know, if we need to somehow, you know, make a linear relation among all the social norms, like prioritize, you know, maybe norm A above norm B, like in this way, how do we make it happen? Like who should be deciding this? Like how do we possibly, you know, like collectively agree on this? Like,
right, yeah. So I'll tell you one factor that I think is going to be important, is that social norms are kind of relativized to a community. This is true in my definition. It's true in most of these other these other conceptions, that you know, a social norm, it doesn't hold globally, it holds within members of a community. And the fact is that we're kind of members of many different communities, sort of higher, you know, overlapping, hierarchically nested, you know, like you're a member of a university community, of a kind of local urban community, you know, maybe you're sort of member of a kind of non-local community of academics that are spread out over the world. And so each of these groups might have different norms. And it might be that sometimes they're coming into conflict, and some of the difficulty that we face in terms of getting people to sort of prioritize certain norms, you know, maybe like the pro-social norms that, you know, reduce the effects of climate change or the pandemic. And maybe this depends on sort of somehow making sure that people are prioritizing a particular community and are sensitive to the norms of a certain of the relevant community where that norm holds, and are not being pulled in some other direction. And so this is a real challenge. So you might think that a sort of avenue for intervention and for is to, how do you induce community people? How do you get people to start thinking in terms of being a part of a particular community where the relevant norms hold, as opposed to other communities where different norms hold? And maybe that starts to get at this question of prioritizing different norms, is prioritizing the communities.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was my part. Hand over to you.
Great. We maybe have time for one last question. I'm looking at the chat.
In the meantime, I'll type the name of Christina Bicchieri's book. I recommend.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
If there's no question right now, maybe I'll have one last exploratory question. That's maybe comes maybe somewhat out of left field. But I was wondering whether, if we accept that all these additional requirements, let's say Bicchieri's representational requirement is too strong, whether there's a place for these requirements when we frame it as absences. So we might think, well, we might not require a reciprocal expectation that others follow the norm as well, but an expectation that they don't would definitely count as a defeater. So what we should require is the absence of a of a expectation that it's not going to be satisfied. What do you think about weakening? I guess that's the question. What do you think about weakening those requirements that these other theorists have, not as positive requirements, but as absences that these requirements are not satisfied in the way I kind of just sketched a little bit?
Yeah, that's interesting. So one way that, so in the sense of should paper, one way that they kind of distinguish between, they offer a way of distinguishing between patterns, the sense of should, and other kinds of conformity, social conformity. They say, okay, well, you have social conformity that's sort of driven by punishment. And you have social conformity that's driven maybe by like informational reasons. So like you conform because you think other people are doing the right thing and you want to do the right thing too. And then you have conformity on the basis of basic moral reasons, where it's motivated because you believe something is the right thing. And then what's sort of left over is the sense of should. And they kind of, the way they outline their problem, the sort of thing that they want to solve is like, well, there's a kind of conformity that isn't just motivated by punishment, that isn't just motivated by, prudential concerns, and it isn't just motivated by moral concerns. And then they go on to sort of specify that. And so there's a sense in which they kind of carve up the territory in this way to say, here's social norms are not these other things. And and then they say, here's what, and then they go on to say, okay, and it's the sense of should. And so that's an approach that's kind of similar. I mean, I think that you can kind of, one thing you can do when you're distinguishing between different kinds of norms is just to distinguish between these kinds of processes, right? And to say like, okay, to the extent that you have norms that are driven by this process, this is one type, and this is another type, and this is another type. And you can sort of use it to give a taxonomy of norm types rather than saying each one of them, these are the real social norms and these ones aren't, because you can say, okay, well, all of these processes are going to kind of produce normative regularities. And you could approach it that way. I'm not sure if that answers your question. I thought you were going to ask a different question, which I've also gotten, which is about how you have a lot of behaviors that are norms are prohibitions about what not to do. And some people have suggested to me that norms that are prohibitions are harder to explain non-psychologically, because like, if you have a prohibition against incest, say, then it's sort of harder to observe people not doing incest, like how do you observe an absence? And so that's what I thought you were going to ask about. And there, I think, you kind of do have to rely on this sort of, okay, well, the exceptions, like the social maintenance of these exceptions, you can also rely on kind of cross-community comparisons. Like if there's a thing that you see in some communities but not in others, it can kind of be evidence that there's a prohibition there. If you have evidence of social maintenance, that's another kind of prohibition. And so you can accumulate evidence for it behaviorally without sort of stipulating that it's a rule that a prohibitory rule that people are following. But that's a tricky case as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Evan, for all these awesome answers. And we're also out of time, just about. And I also realize over there in New York, it's very late already. I think it's 11 p.m. So
it is.
I want to keep Evan much longer, because it is actually quite late. But yeah, I want to thank you, Evan, for this wonderful talk, for giving all these insightful answers to all these questions. I also want to thank the audience for asking all these wonderful questions, for showing up so numerously. And yeah, Evan, thanks a lot for participating in our Friday lecture series here on Saturday morning. And I hope to see you soon.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah, likewise. Thank you, Julius, and thank you everyone for your questions and for your attention. This was a lot of fun for me. I think Julius, I sent Julius the draft paper if people are interested in reading it. And if you have any other comments or thoughts, feel free to send me an email. I will put my email in the chat. And with that, I'll say, have a nice day to everyone. I'm going to go to bed.
Well, enjoy your sleep. And thank you so much, Evan.
Okay.
Yeah. Bye-bye, everyone.